that's something that
especially
me
in India,
myself, being a journalist, should. I mean, I think there is a huge requirement for quality in journalism today, and there's room for one last question. If anyone would like to ask, there's one last question. This is the last question for the session, please.
My question is for Janice, and I'd also like Mr. Tharoor's views on this.
Sorry, I can't hear.
My question is primarily for you from what you just read out, the part about David. So when you say your writing is lyrical in some sense, so does that mean, in maybe a broader sense, does that mean that your writing has to be somewhat larger than life in a romantic fashion, or do you can it be like get into the nuances and still be somewhat realistic and be in the realm of realism?
Okay. I think there's certain passages that call for slightly sort of more lyrical way of saying things. So perhaps it so happened that the excerpts I read in that manner more than the others. But it is the retelling of a Greek myth. So there's plenty of things happening. There's a search for winged horses. There's a quest. There's a hero. There's the tyrannical father. There's a mystery at the heart of it. And so there's plenty of things happening. And also, since it's in first person, it tends to sort of quite fluidly also look inward. Nehemiah is the kind of character who thinks about connections between art and memory and time, and so there are slight meanderings like this that happen through the novel, but it's not always heavily lyrical. I think that would just really destroy the pace of the narrative. You have to be really careful where you decide to place these slightly more lyrical passages. But I think there's also the question of style, that if you have a style that's more sort of fluid, it tends to read a certain way through the book, with some passages that tend to end up more lyrical, as you said.
Can you be lyrical though without being larger than life? Can you still be realistic and
yes, very much. I think the two go. I think the parts where, if I can pick them out in some way, the parts which are most lyrical are also the bits in which he is thinking very deeply about issues that sort of concern him, that are most real to him. So it can definitely be both. Yeah.
Well, the session is concluded. And after the session, the authors will be there, and these are two brilliant authors. If you would want the copy, they'll be personally signing these copies. It'll be right outside here. I would definitely buy it. One day I'll be a rich man if I buy these signed copies. Please give them a very big hand. I think it was a fantastic session. It was very insightful. And please give these two authors another big, and all of you all. To be here at 10 o'clock is indeed something laudable. Thank you so much.
We wish to thank our speakers today. Janice. At Charbagh, we've got Why a Library, Classical Indian Literature. At the Rajnigandha front lawns is Black Swan. At the Google Mughal tent, we have The Man and the Mahatma. British Airways Baithak, the session Imagine from Two Clarice Beans has been cancelled. I repeat, this has been cancelled, and the session that's going to take place at British Airways Baithak at 10 a.m. is The Pike. Session number 162, The Pike, is going to take place at British Airways Baithak at 10 a.m. And at the fourth Samvad, we've got Reaching for the Stars at 10 a.m. And in just a few minutes, we'll start our session on Land at Sea.
I see. They were trying to be very if they have any questions, of course.
50 minutes, I'll let Pradyot throw.
Yeah, sure.
So then he can, wrap up
Sure.
the session and we can take questions from
Sure,
the
yeah,
audience.
that's fine.
And then once you finish, you give me a cue and then
Yes.
Sure, no problem. No problem.
Hello.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Jaipur Literature Festival, brought to you by Rajni Gandha. We're at the Mahindra Humanities Center, Darbar Hall. And our session on land, at sea, we've got Janice, Pariat, Kanishk, Tharoor, and Pradyot Burman.
Good morning, friends. First of all, I think that's much better. Yeah.
More convenient. You have to turn it on.
It's on.
Is it on?
Is it on?
Oh.
Hello. Yeah. Good morning, friends. I would like to. This is a new rule for all of us here, not for the two authors, but let me start by introducing Kanishk Tharoor and Janice Pariat, both who I know very well. Both very young writers, both who have written short stories and who are on the process of writing a novel and have written novels. Kanishk, first, he's written this book, anthology. It's an anthology, it's a clutch of Indian masterpiece, from where he's going to read his excerpts. As well as he's writing this fantastic novel, Swimmer Amongst the Stars.
That's your
Yeah, it's a short. And Janice, of course, has written Boats on Land, and she's writing her novel, written her novel Seahorse, which will be out there for signing after this session. I will not take much time. I would rather have them read out excerpts and speak about their books and novels. Since we believe in equal rights, we'll start with Kanishk, and ladies can follow later. Right? So please. Yeah.
Thank you, Pradyot. And thank you all for coming at 10 a.m. and braving the Jaipur early morning. It's a pleasure to be here. As Pradyot said, I have a short story that was published in this inventively named anthology, A Clutch of Indian Masterpieces, that was published by Aleph, I believe in December or maybe earlier this month. And for me it's quite amusing because, and flattering, because it begins with a short story recently translated from Tharoor and ends with me, since it's ordered by date of birth. So I'm flattered to be in this collection. I also have a collection of short stories forthcoming from Aleph later this year called Swimmer Among the Stars. I'll be reading a little bit from the short story that's in this collection. It's called Elephant at Sea. It's liberally based on a story that was told to me when I was a child about the journey of an Indian elephant within Morocco. So without further ado, let me begin. Elephant at Sea. In the late summer of 1979, the Second Secretary of the Indian Embassy to Morocco received a cable that undid his considerable years of training and left him floundering. The message read simply, "Elephant en route." Was it some sort of code? Further investigation only deepened his confusion. The cable had come from the customs office in Cochin, a port in the south of India. No, the customs officials reported back to him. It wasn't code. It was an elephant that, along with its mahout, was now very much headed by ship to Casablanca. The Second Secretary probed, why send an elephant? Here at the customs office, the reply came, we handle only the movement of goods. For the movement of reasons, please refer your inquiry to the Ministry of External Affairs. The Second Secretary telegrammed his colleagues in the ministry in Delhi. With telegrams to the ministry, it was important first to be terse so that you were considered economical, and second, to be sharp, so that in the midst of reams of communication from outposts around the world, your message would be noticed. Why ship elephant? Stop. Embassy already has cars. Stop. No one in the ministry seemed to know anything about the elephant. A flummoxed telegram returned to the embassy. What elephant? Stop. Is this code? Stop. Embarrassed, the second secretary finally consulted the ambassador, who knew through long experience that it was pointless to question the whims of the capital. Marvelous, the ambassador said, smoothing his moustache. An elephant, just what we need. And they couldn't even send it to us. No, they're sending it to Casablanca. You'll have to arrange for the thing to be met and picked up. He sprayed himself with cologne and mused, if an elephant can even be picked up. That night, the second secretary lay awake in bed, resenting the sheets, resenting the pillow, resenting the indifference of his work, resenting Morocco, resenting Arabic for its impossible secret throatiness, and resenting, with what little bitterness was left to him, the unknown buffoon who would make diplomacy out of elephants. The buffoon was not, as he imagined, some self-satisfied civil servant in South Block, but the Princess of Morocco. Explanation arrived via telex from a friend in the ministry who owed him a few favors, and so mustered the initiative to ask around. The story of the elephant began 6 years earlier in the same Indian embassy in Rabat. At one of those habitual functions whose purpose seems so obvious in the preparation but disappears in the operation, the little Moroccan princess had come to the embassy and frozen before a picture of an elephant. It was among the many stock images, all approved by the Ministry of Tourism, that lined the lobby of the embassy. Dawn over the Himalayan ranges, houseboats on the backwaters, the Taj Mahal rosy in its cushion of smog, a bright tractor devastating a field of wheat. The princess only had eyes for the elephant. Her wordless arm extended towards the picture, pointing. C'est un éléphant, said the embassy official tasked with escorting the princess. She remained transfixed. Vous aimez les éléphants? The unlucky man suggested. It seemed the princess did love elephants because she wouldn't move. The official, who had in previous posts offered counsel on trade policy with Indonesia and arms deals with the Soviet Union, looked around for help before lowering himself to her level. Mademoiselle, vous voulez un éléphant? He asked, with the desperation stoked in him by all children, never mind the Princess of Morocco. She turned, smiled, and gave him the smallest gift of a nod. It was enough. The official eventually spoke to the then ambassador, who put in the request to Delhi, recommending the delivery of an elephant to satisfy the princess and to strengthen a bilateral friendship. The request passed through the appropriate channels at the usual speeds. 6 years later, the creature was irrevocably on its way. The second secretary received updates about the elephant's progress from various consular staff in Yemen. It posed for photographs in front of the oldest coffee house in Aden. It bumped a football back and forth with boys on the beach in Alexandria. In Algiers, veterans of the war against the French held a reception in its honor. The Indian elephant was, in their words, a symbol of the ancient wisdom of a civilization that had inspired the global struggle against Western imperialism. After it passed through Gibraltar, the second secretary got an excited telegram from the British Naval High Command. Brilliant! Stop. Top pachyderm! Stop. The Moroccans were less enthused. What are we to do with it, they said. Casablanca Zoo has enough African elephants, and there's no space for an Indian one. The second secretary protested. It's for the princess, he reminded them. She asked for it. Well, she may have, the Moroccans said, but she's away studying sociology in Paris now and has no interest in elephants. So you might have to take the thing back. Only the Indian ambassador's persistence at a cocktail party won their grudging cooperation. It was agreed that the elephant would be specially housed in a portion of the royal gardens in Rabat. How it would get there was another matter altogether. The Moroccans insisted they had no trucks big enough to carry the creature between the two cities. This was a time of war, and their heaviest military vehicles were all rumbling around the south. Worse, thanks to the mischief of Polisario terrorists, the single rail line between Casablanca and the capital was broken. But these inconveniences, the Moroccans claimed, shouldn't be a problem. After all, the elephant is its own means of transportation. The second secretary was sent to Casablanca to escort the elephant back to Rabat. It took some time to find an appropriate launch in which to ferry the creature to port. When it finally disembarked, the small police band awaiting its arrival had grown sour in the heat. They rushed through the welcoming ditty and swiftly packed away their trombones. The reporters also spread through their work. They found the mahout altogether too clothed. As he perched on the elephant's back, they had him remove his shirt and roll up his trousers to look more convincing for the cameras, all knobby knees and gleaming skin. Instead of asking the mahout questions about the elephant, they surrounded the second secretary. He was wearing a suit. "We are proud to share the joy of the elephants with the people of Morocco," he said. "The hathi belongs not to one nation, but to all." What little the second secretary knew about elephants came from an urban childhood of zoos and encyclopedias. As a measure of their robust memories, elephants hold grudges and harbor very finely developed notions of revenge. Elephants have sensitive feet, capable of feeling through the earth from long distances away the approach of other elephants, or of rainstorms, or of bulldozers. Studies have shown that they can recognize their own reflections, suggesting that, however rudimentary, there may exist among elephants an amorphous theory of mind. In sum, these scraps formed an altogether surreal idea of the elephant, one incommensurate with the full being in front of him, dappled with cooling splashes of mud, blinking restlessly and curling its trunk around the legs of its mahout. The mahout supplied more practical information. In its present ship-weary condition, the elephant could walk at most 40 kilometers at a single stretch, probably no more than 25. "How far is it to the capital?" he asked. He spoke no Hindi, and the secretary spoke no Malayalam, so they talked in a manner of English. "A little more than 90 kilometers to Rabat," the second secretary said. Hoisting himself onto the elephant, the mahout surveyed the road leading out from the docks through the flat outskirts of Casablanca. For all the immensity of this unknown continent, the world always seemed more manageable from the back of an elephant. He smiled at the second secretary. 90 of their Moroccan kilometers, or 90 of ours? "What are you talking about?" the second secretary said. "There's no difference." The mahout shook his head. "You and I may not be able to tell the difference, but the elephant can." Thank you.
Janice?
Yes, that was lovely. I was really enjoying that. I was hoping you wouldn't stop. Thank you. Okay, I've often wondered whether it's tougher to pick out a passage from a short story or from a novel, because, you know, you're trying to sort of compress everything into 5 minutes. Perhaps it's easier from a short story because it's shorter to begin with. Anyway, sorry to meander. I'll be reading from my second book, which is my first novel, and it's called Seahorse, and I will be beginning from the beginning. But before I start, just to give you a little context, it's a book that's a retelling of a Greek myth, and it's set between 1990s Delhi, specifically Delhi University in the north of the city, and contemporary London. So it shifts between the two, and it's told from the perspective of a young man who's in love with an older man who's an art historian. And it opens, the book opens with an absence. His love has disappeared. Everything opens in medias res, in the midst of things. Starting points are fables. Beginnings may come in the middle of someone's life, at its end, or somewhere in between. And so I begin with Nicholas's disappearance, the moment I discovered he was missing. I remember like it was yesterday, although perhaps that isn't an accurate way to phrase it. Yesterday may be further away than 2 years past, than 7 or 10. I can't recall my supper a week ago, but that morning remains palpable in my memory like the touch of sudden heat or tremendous cold. It's a wine I've sipped and sipped so long, it colors everything else on my palate. It was July, but early enough in the day for the air to still be mild, sunshine glimmering white around the edges. I'd arrived at the New Delhi railway station and I hurried back to my room in the north of the city in a taxi, the roads clear and quiet through old Daryaganj, the wide length of Rajghat, the pale fury of the Red Fort. Everything, I felt, was touched by unimaginable beauty. After only a quick shower, I headed to the bungalow on Rajpur Road. I was in a hurry. I took the shortcut through the forest. When I reached, the security guard wasn't at the gate, and the wicker chairs and table on the lawn nowhere in sight. I remember as I walked up the porch, dusty and littered with leaves, how it crept into my heart, a rush of something like love. When I tried the door, it opened easily. The bungalow lay still and silent, everything in its place. The dining table set as though for ghosts, with plates and cutlery, neatly brushed carpets, and arrangement of dried flowers. I headed straight for the bedroom, expecting to find Nicholas sleeping, tangled in a sheet, dream-heavy. Above him, the patient creak of the fan, swirling, the smell of him in the air, sweet and salty, the tang of sweat. He wasn't there. The bed was made in neat geometric precision, his things missing from the bedside table. Only when I reached the veranda did something splinter, and it rushed in, the fear that had been waiting in the wings. In the corner, the aquarium, that bright and complete universe, was empty. Nicholas disappeared in the summer of 1999 when I was 20 and in my second year at university. Although perhaps I need to rephrase that as well. He didn't disappear, he left. Yet who's to say they're not the same? At first, I searched wildly for a note, some sort of written explanation taped to mirrors or doors or walls, weighed down by books or bric-a-brac so it wouldn't be blown away. And then I sat in the veranda and waited. For what? I'm not entirely sure. Later, around midday, when the silence grew deep and thick around me, I left. This time, I took the long way round, back to my room in a student residence hall in Delhi University, along the main road, willing the noise and traffic to somehow jolt me back to life, that this, as cliched as it may sound, had all been a dream. At first, it felt similar to the time I heard about my friend Lenny. Many months ago, my sister's voice, faint and grasping on the phone. I'm sorry, there were some complications. Yet this was not death, for death leaves behind modest belongings, the accumulated possessions of people's lives, their books and jewelry, a hairbrush, an umbrella. Lenny had been my friend. I had his letters, his VHS tapes, his cassettes, and folded away in the recesses of my cupboard back home, his faded leather jacket. With Nicholas, it was as though he had never existed. No life can be traceless and leave behind scarcely any imprints, yet his hadn't. A great rushing tide had swallowed the shore and wiped it clean. That day passed as all others do. In my room, I worked through my unpacking slowly, filled not with anger or despair, but faint, lingering anticipation. Something else had to happen. This couldn't be all. This wasn't the end. I'd receive a letter. Nicholas would return. Someone would come knocking on my door, saying there was a phone call, a message, an explanation. That night, I went to bed in hope. And even now, I sometimes awaken with it wrapped around my heart. We are shaped by absence, the places that escape our travels, the things we choose not to do, the people we've lost. They are spaces in the trellis on which we trail from season to season. Nicholas and Lenny, though worlds apart, are inextricably linked on either side of a diptych, bearing the names of the living and the dead. Thanks.
Kanishk, would you like to say something more about the wonderful story that you...
Well, he was mentioning that it was a story that he'd grown up with, that you'd sort of heard in your childhood. Could you tell us a little more about that?
And elephant, the use of elephant. I mean, you've grown up with it. Did you do it with an idea that elephant is considered one of the most mystic animals, and it's to do with Indian civilization? So, was it a concentrated effort to have the elephant specifically in this book, or is it completely out of what you've heard in your childhood?
I mean, obviously, a lot of people like elephants here, elsewhere, and they are generally crowd pleasers. But no, this story, and I believe in the way I've written the story, isn't trying to, trade on the symbolism of the elephant as a sort of exotic oriental creature. In fact, I think the story undermines that towards the end. But the story that I was told, on which this short story sprung from, was told to me when I was, I think, 10 or 11 years old, and it sort of took on. I think it generally follows the same trajectory as my short story, but as you can imagine, in my childhood, my imagination, it took on sort of larger dimensions and more personal dimensions, and that's what I allowed to blossom in the short story. Janice, I was going to ask you, as somebody sort of slightly more generally, as somebody who, your first book was a collection of short stories, and you've either processed or progressed to a novel. How was the experience of first composing all these short stories and then going to the novel? Was it something you did one after the other? Did it happen simultaneously? And what was the experience of writing both like, and how did it differ?
It was terrifying to begin with. As you know, since you've just finished working on your collection of short stories, I think with short stories, you sort of, especially if you're easily distracted, it's quite an interesting and sort of engaging genre to work with, because if you sort of get stuck with one, you move on to another, and you can generally keep yourself engaged in that manner, and it's harder to distract you from the writing of it. But more seriously, I think that with the novel, and a lot of people say that short stories are more difficult than the novel, but for me it was quite the opposite. It was terrifying to suddenly find myself with this wide and expansive canvas into which I could sort of put in everything, and not have sort of a sense of what I should leave out and what. But it's also extremely exciting. It's suddenly liberating to be able to sort of slow down your pace and sort of just be a little more generous with your own ideas. I think the reason why I sort of fell back onto looking at a Greek myth for a structure was because I had all these ideas for the story, but I couldn't find a form and I couldn't find a particular sort of structure to fit it into. More than a writer, I felt like an orthopedist. I was sort of breaking and re-breaking bones, you know, structural bones, and resetting them and trying to find a shape with which I could flesh out. And serendipitously, as these things usually happen, I came across Robert Graves's The Greek Myths. It's a beautiful folio edition. And these stories inspired me as much as the stories that inspired Boats on Land. And I picked a small myth. It's not a very well-known myth. It's not one of your Achilles and your Hercules. It's not one of these grand sort of Hollywood-type myths. It's a smaller myth about the god of the sea, Poseidon, and his younger male lover, Pelops. And I felt that it was more close to life because, well, in the Greek myth, as you know, Greek myths are extremely murderous and gory and dramatic. And what happens in the original myth is Pelops is killed by his father and served as dinner in a feast for the gods. But of course, that's not what happens in my book. It's made more metaphorical and symbolic than that. But it is a myth about people breaking apart. And it's a myth about people shattering and going through life trying to put themselves together and shattering again and trying to pull yourself back together again and emerging stronger and more beautiful because of that. So it really helped me, at least for my first novel, to have a structure, a pre-made structure in a sense, to work with. Was it the same for you? Because you mentioned earlier that you are now working on a novel as well, right after your collection of short stories.
I am working on a novel, and I have been working on this novel for a few years now. And as you probably can recognize, one of the biggest battles is finding the correct structure for it. And while I feel like I've piled on the pages, it's always been a battle to figure out the form. And I think only in the last about 6-7 months, I've discovered, you know, after maybe the third or fourth iteration and attempt, I've landed on the form that the novel is taking. Sure, it's the novel, which is right now slightly grandiosely titled Mappa Mundi, Mappa Mundi, which is the Latin word for global maps, is set in the 15th century Mediterranean and along the west coast of Africa. I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment, but it follows two parallel narratives around the conquest of Istanbul by the Ottomans in 1453, and along the west coast of Africa with the ships of Henry the Navigator, amongst the first Portuguese expeditions south towards the equator. And so, you know, it's the novel and many of my short stories are very much infused with a lot of the historical issues that have always interested me. I have a background in academic history. I almost sold my soul to academia and became a historian, but somehow fiction clawed me away from that precipice. But still, I maintain those interests. And in one of the ways,
fiction in a lot of ways.
Exactly. Yes. There's a great connection between the two. And in many ways, I find that the kind of history I want to tell is through fiction. And that fiction gives me the best kind of canvas in which to draw those sketches and to make those connections. And so it's quite exciting for me. And I think as Janice was saying, in the short stories, you're given you can sustain a conceit more easily because it's over a shorter period of time. And therefore, it's a great way to experiment with ideas. In my collection that's coming out later this year, I have stories on all manner of subjects, from The Elephant in the Sea, which you just heard, to I have a short story that's about Alexander the Great as he's described in Persian romances, to a description of the United Nations when it is sent into rotating near-Earth orbit because the Earth is too dangerous for the United Nations to be there. So my stories follow all sorts of different interests and trajectories that I've taken in the past, but I can do that. I can be more experimental with them because they are shorter and because they require the less of the sustained discipline that a novel requires, and that's what I'm discovering now. And it is a challenge to write a novel, but it's also a great thrill because it's the production of this sort of monumental building as opposed to the small house of a short story.
Janice, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I know Janice for a long time. We were in Shillong together.
Yes.
And your mention of the North Campus.
Yes, in Delhi.
You were in the North Campus yourself, Mukherjee Nagar, if I'm not so mistaken. How much of your personal experience in terms of walking through the woods and shortcut, the railway station and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
Because I believe that you may have been inspired by the Greek mythology, and but then I think you've also, I mean, I couldn't help noticing that there was a lot of Rudra North and so on and so forth, which you had put in. And can you tell us, I mean, did you take your personal accounts in terms of the entire, because you were in London as well, I think you were.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of you. I don't know if in Nicholas or something, but there's a lot of you.
Yes, of course. I think we tend to, set our stories in the places that we're most familiar with. And Delhi and London are both places that I've spent time in. I've studied in both places and worked in both places. When it comes to North Delhi, I actually found it quite liberating to write as a male voice. When I was studying in DU, there were a lot of restrictions as women students often face. We had to be back in the hostel at a certain time. We couldn't venture into the Ridge Forest for a midnight party. We couldn't stay out all night like most of my guy friends used to do in residence and in college. And we always hear these fantastical stories about what they were up to at night and putting traffic cones on a cross on the top of the tower and silly things like that. And I was really envious. And I think that writing as Nehemiah, as a young man, and using his voice actually liberated me. It made me relive my university days in a way that I never had access to as a woman there. It was great fun. Nehemiah is up to a lot of things, and so are his friends. And these are the things that I've sort of heard about, but never really managed to experience.
Are you sure? Because I know that I got my first tattoo with you around so I think you did have quite a lot of fun. But then the thing which I want to ask Kanishk as well is that when you were growing up, I mean, I just can't get over the fact that you've brought in so much of humor in your story, and yet there is a tinge of sadness that during war the elephant would have to travel from one place to another. There's a lot of insensitivity as well, because this is a animal which can reflect and I just can't help thinking that when we were all growing up, and we would be probably of the same age, I will slightly older, this entire Appu Ghar, Appu, elephant, Ganesh, I mean, I think if you had taken any other animal, it wouldn't have been so touching, or wouldn't have been so, because it's so big and yet so kind-hearted. Do you think that makes a story even more interesting, because it's such a lovely, loving, animal we all love, and yet it can be treated the way it is treated in this context?
Yeah, I think this is the story that when you read the entire story, it is actually quite sad. I know I have a slightly humorous tone, but I think it is a sad story. And elephants are remarkable creatures. Again, I would never consider myself an animal person. I'm vegetarian mostly because I want nothing to do with animals. But yeah, I mean, elephants and whales are the most magnificent mammals on earth, and human beings are mere ants to them. So obviously, it's a beautiful creature, and I know everybody is, but that wasn't necessarily why I picked the elephant. It was just it happened to be in this story that I thought was fantastic, that I was told, and these sorts of stories. This one that was told to me when I was young really excited me because, my upbringing was very much between two cities, between New York, where I grew up most of my life, and Calcutta, where I spent a lot of time every year. And in many ways, those two cities, more than countries, more than religious identities and so forth, or even language backgrounds, have shaped the way I see the world. These two cosmopolitan cities, and two cities that are strung through by people who have traveled, by people who travel, by people from all sorts of places. And my stories, like this one on the elephant, tend to spring from the condition, the very modern condition of displacement, of wandering, of exploration. Of alienation, and so all those things I feel I've tried to load onto the poor, bulky frame of the elephant, and I hope the elephant can sustain that. Should we open up?
Yeah, I think if anyone would like to ask questions to these two young and very bright authors, then you could. Questions if anyone wants to, otherwise you would like to read some more? Would you like to read some more? Yeah,
sure. Okay. I'll read the beginning of another short story that was published a few years ago. This will be in my new collection, yes. This is called Tale of the Tea House. It's about the conversations that take place in a tea shop in a sort of apocryphal Central Asian city in the days before it's destroyed. What's funny is when the story was published, it was in the US. It was imagined that I was talking about Baghdad being sacked by the Mongols in the 13th century, which was not at all my intention. But it goes to show that sometimes the interpretation of the reader is far superior to the intention of the author. Anyway, I'll just read from the beginning of the story. It's okay. 7 days before the Khan's army razed the city, judges presided over their courts, babies were breastfed, the tea house clattered with cups emptied and smashed, puppeteers led shadows through the alleyways, men and women made love, and the hum of schoolboys repeating their lessons echoed from the marble and granite schools. The bakeries pumped out bread, and beggars woke up for yet another day of yellowed nails and coins, as if nothing at all would ever happen. 6 days before the Khan's army razed the city, men and women were making love, especially the captain of the city guard, who squatted his girl on the parapets. Bored, the guards below toyed with the returning merchant caravans, skimming something, a bolt of silk, a barrel of wine, a crate of dates, off the top. The business of the city was business. Off-duty, the guards sneaked to the market to hawk their goods, and then took their earnings to the brothels, from which prostitutes took their money to the bakeries, from which the pastry makers went to the butchers, who in turn visited the vegetable sellers, who shared the bloody passions of the cockfighters, who loved nothing more than long conversations with librarians, who tickled the fancy of the scribes, who penned letters in vain for the washerwomen, who clapped in time for the itinerant musicians, who could play songs remembered only by the astrologer, who promised every trader, for better or worse, a safe return to the city of noise from the quiet of the desert. In the tea house, misty shapes still told their tales, but every so often the gnarled tea drinkers looked at the young, the smooth-faced looked at the old, and all wondered if somehow the world was passing them by. On the 5th day before the Khan's army razed the city, the supply of raisins in the market dried up so suddenly that the fruit seller could only shrug away his queue of customers. By mid-morning, there were no more dates. The street of the tailors soon shook with indignation. "We are running out of silk. Where is this week's shipment?" The long hands, plucked from their looms, curved to ask. In the adjacent neighborhood, the scribes sent their pupils to the gates to see whether the illiterate guards were having some fun and keeping the incoming ink to themselves. While in his dewy tower, the astrologer brooded over turtle shells and began to suspect that only bad things could come from lines so thin. A restless muttering filled the schools. Crows flapped irritably about the rooftops, and women and men were still making love, except for the captain of the guard, whose regular tryst with his squat girl was delayed by a mob of bent tailors and watery-eyed scribes' apprentices. No, his guards hadn't taken their supplies, he said, and no, he didn't know why the caravans hadn't arrived. Would the kind citizens please not crowd before the gates so? And would they return to their quarters and not disturb the city with their tantrums? It was left to the younger guards to disperse the mob, and later, as the day passed into the heat, to receive the breathless rider and his foaming horse and the bad news that always comes on the backs of such creatures. The caravans will not come today, nor tomorrow, nor for all eternity, perhaps. The routes are blocked by an army the size of which I have never seen. It approaches the city. And truth be told, the guards peered towards the horizon below the sun, and for once saw not the heat rippling from the bleached earth, nor the returning black humps of traders, but a faint smudge of dust. The people were informed, "Our city is in grave peril, an army marches on us." An envoy was sent galloping into the distance. Jostling along the walls and atop the towers, the people squinted after him and wondered, how strange it is to fear a tuft of dust. Proclamations were issued urging calm and unity in the face of the enemy and nailed to the doors of shops, and banners were raised in the markets and squares that called for strength and patience and denounced the spread of rumors as a threat to the city. But the denizens of the tea house still told their tales. They too understood that truth lives only in the word and never in a single bitter syllable of their breath. The collection is coming out probably this December, so December 2015. Janice, would you mind please read something more from Seahorse?
So, Seahorse began with absence, as you heard, and absence as a motif continues sort of quite. It's interwoven through the book quite a lot. Absence and the idea of incompleteness, because the story begins with Nicholas missing. For Nehemiah, and I think for a lot of the characters in the book, what doesn't happen holds more sway and more power than the things that have happened. As I think with all of us, I think the things that we don't do are often the things we think about more than the things that we do actually accomplish. So this is a very small little excerpt, somewhere in the middle of the book, when Nehemiah has just received a note, a rather cryptic note from Nicholas, and you would think that he'd be overjoyed that he is back in touch with an old love who he adored, and it's 10 years later, and all of this promise, might come to something. But suddenly he finds himself wary, because I think love that is incomplete sometimes draws us more than love that is closed and accomplished. So this is a little passage from after he receives this mysterious letter. If you visit the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence and walk into the hallway where David is displayed, it's difficult to look at anything else. When you enter, he's to the right, and you are suitably entranced. They've positioned him beneath a glorious dome, and he's bathed in natural light. He is an angel. You circle him slowly, gazing up, casting your eyes over his limbs, studying the shape of perfection carved out of a 19-foot block of marble. Your thoughts are sparse, limited by awe. Somehow, words and emotions seem inappropriate, out of place. Yet if you enter and turn left, you encounter something else entirely. Michelangelo's Prisoners. Placed in a dark corridor, rows of figures commissioned for the never-completed tomb of Pope Julius II. They are unfinished, perpetually wrestling with stone. Unlike most sculptors who built a model and then marked up their block of marble to know where exactly to chip, Michelangelo always sculpted freehand, starting from the front and working his way back. So these figures emerge from stone as though surfacing from a pool of water. They will not stun your mind into silence, rather they rouse it. You are moved by their frailty, their endurance. They are endless metaphor and infinite possibility, much the same as anything unfinished in our own existence. We treasure the incomplete, for it lends us many lives, the one we lead and the million others we could have led. We are creatures of inconsistency, passionately partial, unexecuted, unperformed, undone, unaccomplished, and unconcluded. David will only be David.
If anyone would like to have a few questions, please feel right there.
Hello. Yeah, so my question is to Janice. So Janice, you've written a collection of short stories and now you have finished a novel. I haven't read any of your books, but I have read a lot of excerpts. But from what I understand and from what you have read as well, it looks like you have a very lyrical style, a very poetry-based sort of writing. So what do you think do you not think of yourself more as a poet? And why don't you write poetry? Why do you stick to prose?
I don't like labels to begin with. I think I write, and I used to write poetry, and I'd like to think that the small poet's voice that lives on in me somehow finds its way into everything that I write. I love the ambiguity of poetry, the playfulness of poetry. I love that poetry just adds such resonance to prose as well. So I think that it's really hard to separate these things sometimes. I know that poetry is, of course, a lot about form and meter, but I think there's a certain lyricism that can blanket your work regardless. Yeah.
And I would just add to that, that as somebody writing fiction, it is, for me, a tremendous resource to read poetry.
Yes.
My fiance, who's in the audience, is a poet, and it's been wonderful for me to sort of empty my mind of prose and prosaicness and fill it with poetry. It can be really restorative as you write. And that sensibility is also something that I think the best fiction also has and needs. So I would echo Janice in saying that we should never have too hard and fast a boundary between fiction and poetry.
Any questions? I have a question actually for you. There's so much of, you cannot ignore the fact that you're a historian, or you at one day going to be an historian. And whether it's what we haven't read about Alexander or what you've written about what's going to happen in Iraq after the Mongols invaded, or the entire Indian diplomatic mission. there is so much of history in it. So can we expect in the future a book which would be more descriptive and less fiction and more on history, or do you have an aspiration of becoming, I mean, crossing over and becoming a person who documents history as well, because there's a lot of history in whatever you write?
I mean, this is, at the moment I'm obviously focusing on my fiction, and so it seems very immodest of me to say, yes, you should expect books of nonfiction from me soon, but I have a background in journalism as well, and I have political interests, historical interests that I would love to explore in nonfiction as well as fiction. So one day potentially, I would definitely also like to produce books of nonfiction. Again, actually, like reading poetry, I find often that I read fewer novels than I read books of nonfiction, and I find books of nonfiction a great resource for fiction. So I think, you know, as somebody who's writing, I would remain open to engaging with the world in various ways, both through telling invented tales and through documentation.
Janice? Yeah. I mean,
I was just mentioning that there's also creative nonfiction, which blurs these lines that we sort of, you know, we've been talking about. What you were reading out might also read as a historical document in sort of an extremely sort of long form journalistic piece, you know, but doesn't mean it's any less sort of interesting or lyrical.
Yeah, I think in the US where I live, I think there's been a conscious effort to revive the essay as a creative form. And I think that's quite exciting. Whether there's a market for that, we don't know. But I guess as writers, we have to try to make the market for that kind of work. But no, it is, again, I think it's, you know, these issues of genre and form, especially for a young writer, can be a bit difficult to navigate because you feel the need to commit in some way to some category. But at the end, but my hope is that that commitment isn't necessary and we can straddle as many lines as possible. In our art and in what we're doing, yeah.
Sorry, you had a question?
yeah, there's a question we would like to have.
I think when you start writing, you're not consciously thinking of, you know, genre and category and this is exactly what I'm doing. It just happens, and then the labels come later. You know?
I think one of the travesties of modern American letters is the term genre fiction. It's really
There you go.
a nonsense term.
We have a
Sorry.
question.
I read all of what you've ever written, actually.
Thank you.
So after boats and Seahorse, are we looking for more poetry or another book? What's your plan?
I have a slim collection of poetry coming out later in the year. It's called A Memory of Place. But the last time somebody asked me this question, what are you working on after Boats on Land, I proudly proclaimed that I'd be doing a novella, and you know, I'm fascinated by the novella. It's precariously balanced between the short story and the novel, and then I failed. And then a year later, I had to sort of correct all my interview answers and tell everyone, no, that didn't really work. It's become a novel. So this time, I'm going to say I shall not give too many details about the next book. Oh, thank you. Okay. Sorry, there's a question there.
My question is to Mr. Kanishk Tharoor. Sir, you mentioned that the new novel which you're writing, it is based in 15th century, so the war around Istanbul and all. So, like, what is the sort of amount of research that you put in to do this?
Thank you for the question. I've studied academically these regions and that history quite extensively, but also I've been to those places. I've been to across the Mediterranean, to the west coast of Africa, to Portugal, to the city that was Constantinople, and so that travel there has obviously helped a bit. At the same time, in the principle of it, I don't think a writer of fiction needs to have been to places that person is writing about. I think the liberty of fiction and the great the great ambition of fiction is to be free, is to free the relationship between experience and what you actually compose. Obviously, I think many writers have the opposite view, but I think that's what fiction can accomplish. It so happens that I had been to those places that I'm writing about now, but you know, I'm writing about them from 600 years ago, 500 years ago.
It's fantastic because no one can ask you, is that autobiographical?
I mean, I'd have to be some kind of immortal vampire for that to be autobiographical.
Highlander.
Yeah, exactly.
Highlander, yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not. So no, and you know, I haven't yet actually written about myself. Perhaps one day I will. Yeah. But no, I have so many. Unfortunately, I'm quite the historical geek, and I have a lot of historical interests. So for me, they're an endless source for filling into fiction.
This question is for Mr. Kanishk Tharoor. Mr. Tharoor, you're a journalist, if I'm not wrong. You're also a journalist. So what I've observed is that mostly in specifically political journalists, though they have immense knowledge of their fields about politics, but they're not very well read when it comes to literature. So, my question is, if there is some journalist, let's say, who has a good grasp of both these spheres, how does it impact his journalistic career as a political journalist?
It's an interesting question. I think there used to be a time, you know, before I was born, when it was very common to have people who felt empowered to inveigh on subjects of both cultural and political merit. There was a earlier time of public intellectuals who were equipped and accomplished to speak on both fields without any sense of hesitation. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's sad that that species of public intellectuals seems to have disappeared across the English-speaking world. I don't just mean, I'm not equipped to talk about the non-English-speaking world, but but in the English-speaking world, it's rare today to find people who can, as you suggest, navigate those two fields. I mean, I think it's premature for me to say that I can do that, but obviously, as somebody who's generally engaged in the world, I feel that, you know, to have a sense of, to have a kind of political engagement with the world as well as a cultural engagement is absolutely necessary and indispensable. I mean, you know, culture and politics, again, are not fields that you could necessarily disentangle so easily. So, you know, if you really aspire to be fully engaged with the world around you, with contemporary events, with changes in society, you need to have some broader sense of both.
And I think that quality writing can only improve